So after Ace Combat 4, the franchise was set up for success. The game was not only the most critically acclaimed in the franchise, but it also outsold both Ace Combat 2 and 3. This might sound great, and that's because it is, but it also means that the pressure was on the Project Ace's team to make a worthy successor. And I know that for a lot of you in the comments and the live stream chats, this is your personal favorite in the franchise, so again, my expectations were pretty high going into this one. So, was Ace Combat 5 the Unsung War ultimately an improvement over the prior title, or does it fall short? Well, let's talk about it. And before getting too far into the video, I should mention that this is the 5th in a series of videos where I'm playing every Ace Combat game for the first time and reviewing them as I go along. And while you don't have to have seen the rest of the videos in order to enjoy this one, you'll be missing a lot of important context about my journey with the series if you haven't seen them, so I'll have the full playlist linked in the description below for those of you that want to go check those out first. But with that out of the way, Ace Combat 5 The Unsung War is a combat flight simulation game developed and published by Namco for the PlayStation 2 in 2004. In AC5, we play as Blaze, a pilot fighting in a war between the fictional countries of Osea and Yuktobania. And the Project Ace's team had 3 major focuses during this game's development. The first 2 were both based on the visuals of the game, with them wanting to create environments that were on par with computer gaming graphics of the time, as well as working with various aircraft manufacturers to allow their art team to go and examine the planes in person before creating their in-game counterparts. The third main focus of this game's development was the desire for a more personal and character-driven story than what was seen in Ace Combat 4, but we'll come back around to that later in the video. But for now, let's focus in on that visual presentation and get that out of the way. To start, the UI is mostly the same as in AC4, although the briefings are slightly better. They still don't have that level of detail that the first couple games did, allowing you to see the skill level and the exact aircraft of individual enemies, but at this point, it seems like the franchise just isn't going to bring that back, so I might as well stop mentioning it. The briefings do at least allow you to pan around and zoom in on specific sections of the briefing, so it does improve upon AC4's briefings, even if it is the tiniest of improvements. That being said, unfortunately, the in-game HUD doesn't fare as well. Those of you that saw the Ace Combat 4 video already know, but I had very high praise of the first-person HUD in that game for how it conveys so much information with minimal clutter or visual disruption. Ace Combat 5 essentially uses the same HUD blueprint, but every element of the HUD has been made a little larger than it was in that game, as well as some new things being added like these friendly indicators that occasionally add in some clutter that wasn't present before. At the end of the day, it's not something that detracts from the game all that much, but it is a slight downgrade from the previous game, and I generally like to bring things like that up. Aside from that though, the visuals have been mostly upgraded from AC4, but it's very subtle. The textures along the terrain have been improved and seem to be in a higher compressed resolution than in the previous game, and of course, the plane models look considerably better as well. You can really see how much work the art team put into making these look better than anything else on the market at the time, and obviously having the developers go to see the aircraft in person during the research stages went a long way in helping the team reach that goal. Along with that, Ace Combat 5 adds some really high quality mid-mission cutscenes into the mix, and they look pretty great. Cutscenes like this really allow them to sell more important story moments to players during the missions, and allows them to throw even more of those mid-mission curveballs at the player like they started to do with the 4th entry. And of course, we have to wrap up the presentation section with the music. Compared to Ace Combat 4's more diverse soundtrack, the majority of AC5 sticks to a very orchestral style with some rock music being mixed in here and there. That being said, it's still very good orchestral music and it fits the gameplay incredibly well. I just personally don't enjoy listening to the soundtrack on its own as much as I do listening to 4's. But take a listen and see what you think. But getting into the gameplay talk, I've come to realize through my time with these games that the controls can be one of, if not the most important component of Ace Combat's gameplay. And thankfully here, the controls feel nearly identical to Ace Combat 4, which, as I said in that video, had the best controls in the franchise by far. And honestly, while I'm sure there are differences between the two controls-wise, I didn't really feel any. People who have played both 4 and 5 extensively could probably tell you the really subtle differences between the two, but for myself and for other more casual fans, the two feel almost identical, so I'll leave that to the more experienced fans to discuss in the comments. Another thing that I discovered very early on is that for the first time in the franchise, colliding with other aircraft will actually kill you now. And when I say that I discovered it very early on, it took exactly 3 minutes and 54 seconds of playtime for my squad mate to fly into me from behind and kill me. Now that might make it sound like this is a common problem, but this is the only time I ever had a squad mate crash into me mid-air. Not that I never crashed into other planes throughout the game. Aside from that fairly small change though, the gameplay in general is pretty much exactly like Ace Combat 4. Which, in case you haven't noticed the pattern yet, is a very common theme for this video. There are a lot of things that make AC5 feel like its own unique experience from 4, and we'll be talking a lot about that, but most of those changes come from things like the systems and the campaign structure rather than the core gameplay. So with that in mind, let's talk about the campaign a bit more. Much like the AC4 campaign, all missions in this game are played in a set linear order from beginning to end, but this game is much longer than 4 was. Ace Combat 5 had the longest development cycle of any of the Ace Combat games so far, and some of that time clearly went into adding a lot more content to the game. AC5's campaign has 28 missions compared to AC4's 18, but lengthwise, it's about twice as long of a game as 4 is, at least in my personal experience. And normally, having this many missions would seriously run the risk of the gameplay getting stale by the end of the campaign, but the mission variety here is probably the best in the series. Not only did the team think of a bunch of completely new objectives and gimmicks, such as having you eliminate a nerve gas attack with chemical bombs, or a coordinated stealth strike on an enemy base, requiring you to sync up your missile strikes with the rest of the team in order to avoid enemies alerting the base via radio, but along with this, they also built upon the idea that some of Ace Combat 4's missions played with, having mission objectives completely change on the fly as you move through them, rather than just doing what the original trilogy did and sending you in to complete one specific task. So not only does this game have the most variety in terms of mission objectives, but it's also constantly changing those objectives and redirecting you, ensuring that you're never doing the same thing for more than 5 or 10 minutes at a time. Along with this, Ace Combat 5 introduces mid-flight briefings to the series, which are an interesting addition. Sometimes when you're changing objectives, the gameplay will pause wherever you are to give you an entirely new briefing explaining what you're meant to do. At first, I wasn't much of a fan of these since I felt like you could just give the player all of that information by speaking to them while they're playing the game, but some of these objectives are fairly complicated and need some sort of visual explanation to make sense for first-time players, and obviously trying to pay attention to these while playing the game would be a disaster, so it's somewhat of a necessary evil. Now, some of you might think, wow, so these missions are just as long if not longer than in Ace Combat 4. Thankfully, they added that mid-mission resupply mechanic to balance out how long the missions take. And those of you familiar with the game will know where this is going, but for whatever reason, this feature was actually removed from Ace Combat 5. This led to me running out of missiles and being stuck with just my machine guns more than any other game in the franchise up to this point. And this is a really mixed bag of a change for me because on one hand, I really enjoyed the balance between time and efficiency that this brought to the game, but on the other, I can respect that the developers might have wanted you to use your missiles much more thoughtfully than you have in previous games, hence the removal of it. That being said though, machine guns got another massive buff from AC4 here. Not only did the change from 4 carry over where the machine gun indicator is much more accurate than in the PS1 trilogy, but in AC5, they actually got a massive damage increase. Machine guns absolutely shred through ground targets and enemy aircraft alike in this game, and as if that wasn't enough, you now have infinite machine gun ammo, meaning that you're free to fire these things off as much as you please with no hesitation. So again, I think that the removal of the mid-mission resupply and the buff to the machine guns are both meant to make you use your missiles much more carefully and thoughtfully throughout your missions. And even though I might personally prefer blasting things with my missiles rather than my machine guns, I can really respect the developers wanting to move in that direction, and if that was their intent, I can recognize that they absolutely nailed it. And these ammo economy changes definitely factor into this game being more difficult than previous games. The Ace Combat games have fluctuated in difficulty a lot throughout the run of the series up to this point, and honestly, I would say that Ace Combat 5 is the most difficult game since the original, which for the record, I still find air combat to be the hardest game in the series even after playing this one. I always do my first playthrough for these videos on the normal difficulty, and this is the only game since the first to actually give me a hard time on some missions. Obviously with this, I can't speak to the highest difficulty for every single one of these games yet, but as far as these initial normal difficulty playthroughs go, this is definitely the runner-up for most difficult in the franchise so far. But getting back to campaign structure stuff, purchasing various aircraft that you unlock as you progress has returned once again, but with some interesting differences that are worth noting. The first, and most noteworthy in my opinion, is that you can now purchase multiple of each individual plane, since you'll have to select your own plane for each mission, as well as assign your squad mates to one. So if you want to have multiple members of your squad piloting an F-15, you're gonna have to buy 2 or 3 F-15s rather than just the one. And this adds a really interesting dynamic to the game because you can set up your squad to be fully geared for air-to-air combat, air-to-ground combat, or a combination of the two if you just want to play it safe. Along with this, they've also changed how you unlock new aircraft to purchase. As you progress through the game, you'll unlock new planes to purchase like you have in previous games, but there are also these small unlock trees tied to each one of them. By using a plane, you can slowly gain experience for it, and once that XP bar is filled, you'll unlock the next plane on that tree. And the developers even tutorialize this for players, locking you into using just the starter plane for the first 4 missions, ensuring that you'll unlock the second jet on its tree before they actually open up more to purchase. This is an incredibly interesting change because it makes it so that you can't unlock every single jet in a single playthrough and gives the player more of a reason to replay the game, as well as to use and get comfortable with various different aircraft to be able to see and collect all of them. And interestingly, purchasing different special weapons for these planes has been removed here. And while I appreciated the extra customization that it added in the previous game, I also see the value in having a set special weapon for each individual jet, giving each of them a more distinct role in the sandbox and specific reason to be chosen for a mission. Now, rather than a plane that specializes in air-to-ground combat simply getting a faster missile lock on ground targets, they'll also get things like bombs or long-range air-to-ground missiles, which would obviously be a lot better for some missions than long-range air-to-air missiles. So again, while I really enjoyed having that customization to choose for myself, I also respect having each jet have a very unique role within the game, and I think that this ultimately adds a very interesting dynamic to selecting what aircraft you use for each mission. But something that really surprised me about Ace Combat 5's campaign was just how much of a focus there was on the player character's relationship with their squad mates. There's a ton of dialogue with your squad mates during missions, and they've even added a little feature where you can respond to questions of theirs using the D-pad. And something that longtime fans will be very happy about is that this game brings back Edge, one of the 2 available wingmen from Ace Combat 2, as a primary member of your squad. Although with this addition, it seems like they might have completely retconned AC2 from the timeline, as during the events of AC2 in the late 90s, Edge is actually an ace pilot, but here in this game that takes place in 2010, she's a rookie. Not really important, but just something I thought I'd point out. That being said though, some missions are insanely dialogue heavy to the point where they hold back the gameplay a bit. There are frequent moments where you'll spend a full minute or two just flying idly and listening to dialogue, and if these sections are placed at the beginning of a mission, you better hope you don't have to retry it many times. There was one mission that took me a good 5 or 6 tries during my playthrough that had 2.5 minutes of dialogue at the beginning before you actually started playing. Meaning that I spent about 15 minutes of my playthrough just listening to dialogue I had already heard in order to retry a mission. But as much as that takes away from the gameplay experience, I should also mention that this game has my personal favorite story in the series so far. As I mentioned earlier, AC5 tells the story of the player character Blaze and his squad during the events of a war between the fictional nations of Osea and Yuktibania. At the beginning of the game, Blaze and his squad are getting flight training from their captain when an enemy spy plane appears, and the spy plane, when we go to check it out, calls in escort fighters, leading to a sudden dogfight that would act as the first spark to the war between the two nations. So not only do we get to see the very beginning of the war, but we also start out as trainees, barely qualified to be in a combat situation in the first place. And with that, we get a really nice progression with our squad throughout the campaign, going from those trainees in the beginning of the game to the president's personal air fleet that strikes fear into the enemy forces on sight by the end of it. And on top of that, there's a lot of political intrigue as well, with it slowly coming to light that both Osea and Yuktobania are being manipulated into fighting one another by the country of Belka. Belka lost a war to both of these nations years prior and not only wants revenge, but also happens to be the one providing weapons to both sides, meaning they profit a good deal from the fighting as well. There are Belkan spies in the ranks of both nations, high-ranking officials who are fully in the pockets of the Belkans, and a lot of surprises that come from a story like this. One of which is the discovery that both Osea and Yuktobania have an ace squadron of Belkan pilots who infiltrated the ranks, whom we fight with many times in the latter half of the campaign. My favorite encounter with these guys is one in a mission where you can't fly above the walls of a ravine due to enemy radar and SAM sites, but suddenly some of the Belkan aces appear and start dogfighting you within the canyon. Up to this point in the series, these ravine missions have only ever focused on navigation, maybe having some AA guns or helicopters to blast along the way, but nothing beyond that. So having a full-blown dogfight inside of one is incredibly intense, even if you've played through all the games up to this point. And the end of the story is packed with set pieces like this in general, with the final assault against the Belkans being focused on destroying the control center for a satellite weapon they have in orbit. It might sound simple enough, but the control center is deep underground, and while it would make more sense to send ground forces in, this is an ace combat game. So of course, we have to send fighter jets deep into these underground tunnels to destroy it. So we go in through these very narrow tunnels, blow it up, and on the way back out, they even start closing the shutters on you, forcing you to fly at high speeds while navigating them again, which forced me into coming a little closer than I would like to crashing. And for the final mission, we get a final dogfight with all of the remaining Belkan aces, quickly followed up by needing to shoot the previously mentioned satellite weapon out of the sky as it started falling from orbit towards a nearby city after we destroyed the controls. While the campaign certainly has its issues in this game, the story and the set pieces are easily the best in the franchise so far, and it makes me really excited to see how they build off of this in the next few titles. Overall, I really enjoyed Ace Combat 5, but there were definitely some decisions made during development that held it back. I really enjoyed the pace of the gameplay, the length of the campaign, the story, and the mission variety, but it feels like for every step forward that AC5 takes, it also took a step back. The heavy focus on the dialogue and the cinematic storytelling is great for a first playthrough, but when you get stuck on a mission, it can get pretty infuriating, and I could definitely see it being annoying on repeat playthroughs as well. And it's worth mentioning here at the end that the game also features an arcade mode, which is essentially made up of a smaller campaign of much smaller missions of Mobius 1 from Ace Combat 4, cleaning up the remnants of the Erusian forces after the events of that game. It's still a damn good game with a lot of things to offer, but I'd be lying if I told you that I preferred it over the previous game. So at the end of the day, I'm going to give Ace Combat 5 The Unsung War an 8.4. But what do you guys think? Those of you that have played the game, those of you learning about it for the first time through this video, let me know in the comments below. And if you guys enjoyed the video, feel free to leave a like, a comment, a subscription, anything to let me and the algorithm know that you did enjoy. It helps me out a lot, so I'd really appreciate it. And if you weren't aware before, I do live stream on the channel every single day, and recently we've been doing some fun challenge runs, like me trying to complete all the Ace Combat games on the hardest difficulty, or even more challenging, I've been trying to get every single S rank on every single difficulty of the Devil May Cry games, so feel free to stop by sometime and say hi. We have a really friendly community, and you can just come and hang out and talk games for a bit. It's a good time. And hey, if you enjoyed this video and you haven't seen them already, then you definitely enjoy the rest of my Ace Combat videos, or maybe even another series we recently started doing the exact same thing for the Metal Gear games. So if you're interested, I'll have both of those linked right here on screen.